The blood in the snow. The first light of April in Montana cast a fragile warmth across the pale blue sky, streaked in pink like bruises healing after a long winter. Virginia Odell stepped out from the cabin with a basket under one arm, boots crunching over the frost-stiffened grass as she made her way toward the trap lines. Her wool shawl clung tightly around her shoulders, the ends fluttering against her skirts as the morning wind needled its way through the layers. She wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just the stillness of dawn, the quiet tasks that filled her mornings now that she lived alone. But halfway down the winding dirt path, something caught her eye, a splash of crimson against the snow. Small at first, like berries dropped from a bush, then more irregular, smeared trailing toward the rise behind the trees. Her breath caught, not in fear, not yet, but in a kind of alertness that made her move faster, the basket forgotten. She knew the woods behind her land, like she knew the lines of her own hands, but that didn't mean they were always safe. Following the trail with her eyes sharp, she pushed through a thicket of scrub boots, slipping once on a patch of ice. Just over the rise, she stopped cold. It was a horse, young, maybe 2 or 3 years old, a roan with a jagged tear along its shoulder, blood still sluggish where the flesh had been ripped, likely from barbed wire. The animal was collapsed on its side flanks, heaving legs twitching when it tried and failed to rise. Its eyes rolled toward her, wide with panic and pain. Instinct overruled hesitation. She dropped to her knees in the snow, hands already moving. "Easy now," she murmured, voice low and firm like she'd used for the stray dogs her brother used to bring home. "You're not alone." She peeled off her shawl and wrapped it around the horse's neck, pressing her palm to its muzzle. Its breath came in ragged puffs, warm against her skin. It was trembling violently. She could feel its life hanging by a thread in the cold air, and without another word she stood and sprinted back to the cabin, skirts flying behind her. The first kindness. Virginia returned not 10 minutes later, breathless and red-cheeked arms full of supplies. Strips of linen, a tin of salve from the kitchen shelf, a small pail of warm water she'd set by the fire only a half-hour earlier. She dropped to the ground beside the horse again, this time moving like someone who had done this before. Her fingers trembled in the cold, but worked quickly. She cleaned the wound, rinsed it gently, though the horse flinched at each touch. The snow around them turned pink, then muddy brown as she worked. The animal didn't resist much after that, too weak. Its trust came not from recognition, but from lack of options. Still, she whispered to it the whole time. "You hold on, all right. We're not done yet." She packed the salve into the wound with practiced care and wrapped it tightly, pulling the linen snug to keep the dressing in place. Her hands had gone stiff by the time she finished, knuckles scraped raw, but she didn't seem to notice. Instead, she eased back onto her heels and sat in the snow beside the animal, letting its shoulder lean gently into her leg. It smelled of sweat and blood and the wild. She stayed there until the shaking began to calm, until the horse's breathing slowed just enough that she could believe it might survive. Then she heard it, the steady, deliberate sound of hoofbeats approaching. Not fast, not urgent. Just the rhythm of a rider who wasn't expecting to find anything unusual. Virginia rose to her feet, tucking the wet linen back into the tin and shifting between the animal and the sound. Her eyes scanned the tree line, and then through the haze of dawn and pine he appeared, Cade Nalin. The man rode a tall chestnut, gelding his coat dusted with snow, and a rifle slung across his back. He didn't speak when he reached the rise, just took in the scene, eyes sharp as they landed on the roan lying bandaged in the frost. Without a word, he dismounted and crouched beside the animal. His presence wasn't loud. If anything, it carried a stillness, as if he were used to silence more than company. "That one yours?" Virginia asked, voice-even eyes watching him. He nodded once. "Ran off yesterday in the storm. Thought I'd lost him for good." His voice was rough, low, like stones tumbling over one another. "You fixed him up?" he asked, not with judgment, but with something like surprise. "I tried. He needs rest and someone to keep the wound clean." He looked at her, then really looked, and something shifted in his gaze. "You found him at dawn." She nodded. Wasn't going to leave him to die. He stood slowly, tall and broad-shouldered, dark blonde hair curling beneath his hat. Dust clung to his boots. His face was handsome in a worn kind of way, with tiredness in the corners of his eyes that hadn't been earned in one night. "I'm Cade Nalin," he said after a moment, "and I owe you." "You don't owe me anything," Virginia replied. "He needed help. That's all." Cade brushed a hand along the horse's mane. "Not many would have done what you did." Virginia shrugged. "I was raised better than to walk away from something hurting." Her voice broke a little on the last word, and when she turned her face from him, Cade saw the grief that lived just beneath her strength. He didn't say anything about it, just crouched again and checked the dressing. "You're good with animals," he said quietly. "I've lost enough of them to know how to keep one breathing." She hesitated, then added, "He shouldn't walk far. You can leave him here if you want." Cade looked up. "You sure?" She nodded. "There's a lean-to by the barn. Keeps the wind off. I'll come by tomorrow. Make sure he's still standing." Virginia gave a small nod. She turned toward the barn, and Cade walked beside her. Quiet but present, the kind of quiet that lingered after the storm had passed. The first walk to the barn. They moved together across the frost-silvered yard, the morning light rising slow behind them as they guided the horse. Flint, though she didn't know the name yet, toward the lean-to near the barn. Cade walked close on the other side, one steadying hand resting against the horse's neck. He didn't say much, but there was something intentional in his silence, as if he didn't want to disturb the peace that hung in the air. The animal limped with each step, but didn't protest. It leaned against Virginia now and then, trusting her weight like it already knew she'd saved its life. The world around them began to wake. A hawk cried above the pines, and the wind carried the scent of distant firewood and wet bark. Virginia's cabin came into view, modest, a little tired but clean and solid. The roof was patched in places with careful hands, and the fence line stood proud against the elements. Cade looked around as they passed, noting the full trough, the repaired gate, hinges, the piles of stacked wood by the porch. A woman who survived alone out here didn't just get by. She held her world together with quiet discipline. "You've been out here long?" he asked, his voice quiet, more observation than curiosity. Virginia paused at the barn rail, resting her hand on the gate latch. "Since my brother died. Last winter." There was a brief hush. Cade didn't say anything right away, but when he did, his tone had shifted. "I'm sorry." She nodded once, face still turned toward the gate. Her lips pressed into a flat line, and then she moved again, opening the barn and guiding the horse inside. Cade followed his eyes, drawn not to the space itself, but to the way she moved through it. Purposeful, calm. She checked the wound again with practiced hands, and he watched not with suspicion, but with something closer to respect. Maybe even awe. There was strength in her stillness, a kind of strength he hadn't seen in a long while. "You sure you're all right out here by yourself?" he asked as she reached for a bucket of water. Her answer came quick. "I don't need anyone worrying for me." He shook his head gently. "That's not what I meant." Virginia glanced at him, then meeting his eyes fully for the first time since they'd met. She didn't flinch. "I know." And something passed between them in that moment, mutual recognition maybe. Not of weakness, but of pain carried well, of endurance learned the hard way. "I'll be back tomorrow," Cade said finally, stepping away. She nodded once and watched him as he mounted his horse and disappeared into the trees. The roan stirred behind her, nosing at the hay. She turned and brushed her hand down its mane. "You brought me someone decent," she whispered. The horse blinked slowly as if in agreement. He kept coming back. The next morning, Cade returned, and the morning after that, always with something in hand, oats for the roan coffee in a tin cup for her. Virginia didn't ask questions, but Cade volunteered pieces of himself anyway, letting the silence between them hold his words like water in a basin. He'd worked as a trail scout for a while, then as a cattle wrangler down near the Bitterroots. No wife, no children, just the road a saddle and the ghosts that trailed him. In return, Virginia offered little, but it wasn't coldness, it was the kind of quiet shaped by grief, not guardedness. She listened while he talked, her hands busy with tending the wound or checking the trap lines. And when he brought fence nails or helped lift a water trough, she let him without protest. One morning, as she knelt to wrap fresh bandages around the horse's healing shoulder, Cade leaned on the stall door and watched her. "You saved him," he said. She looked up, frowning faintly. "He would have lived." "Not without you." Her hands paused. She stood slowly brushing hay from her apron. "I did what anyone decent would have." "No," Cade said, his voice softer. "You did more." The words settled between them like dust after a long ride. She turned her head, flustered, unsure what to do with praise spoken so plainly. "You don't have to—" "I want to," he interrupted gently. She narrowed her eyes. Why, he didn't hesitate. "Because I haven't seen someone care like that in a long time." That stopped her. Not the words, but the honesty in them. She looked away, fingers brushing the roan's mane. "I'm not used to people noticing." "I noticed," he said. And he kept noticing. Every day he showed up, sometimes to work, sometimes just to sit. He helped mend the barn roof when the wind peeled the shingles. He laughed at her dry humor. He listened when she spoke and didn't try to fix anything she didn't ask him to. By the time the frost melted and the hills turned green again, Cade was spending more time at her barn than anywhere else. And Virginia, for the first time in months, began to hope again. Acts of quiet love. By the end of April, Cade had built her a new gate for the south pasture. He hadn't asked. He'd just noticed the old one sagging on rusted hinges, then showed up one morning with cedar slats and a hammer slung over his back. Virginia stood on the porch that evening, apron dusted with flour, the smell of hot bread drifting through the open door. She didn't thank him with words. Instead, she handed him a tin plate without comment and led him to the bench beneath the cottonwood tree. They ate together while the sun dipped behind the hills, the sounds of crickets and creek water wrapping around them like an old song. "You hammer like a man trying not to think," she said, eyes on her fork. Cade smiled, faintly chewing slow. My father used to say I was like that, always fixing something when I didn't want to feel. She nodded but didn't press. He was a blacksmith, he added. Quiet man. Big hands. Drank too much after Mama died. Passed when I was 15. I left that same week. Virginia looked at him, then not with pity, but with recognition. This land, he said, gesturing toward the fields around them. It feels like something that stays. Most places I've been don't. She reached for a napkin, brushing crumbs from her lap. I planted lilacs behind the smokehouse. My brother said they'd never bloom up here. She set her plate down. They bloomed the spring after he died. Cade leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You miss him, she answered without pause. I miss knowing someone who remembered me before life got hard. The breeze stirred her hair, and he watched her tuck a loose strand behind her ear, the gesture so simple it broke his chest a little. You're not the only one carrying ghosts, he said quietly. You always this honest with strangers, she asked. Cade looked at her eyes unreadable. You stopped being a stranger when you wrapped linen around my horse. She blinked, heat rushing to her face. You never said what you named him, she said to change the subject. Cade glanced at the horse, then smiled. Flint. Always been stubborn as rock. Fitting, she murmured. And in that moment, with the light fading and supper finished, something deep and unspoken was laid gently between them like seeds, placed carefully in soil, waiting for spring. A question left unspoken. The next morning came with soft wind and pale sun. Cade rode in before noon, saddle-creaking coat flapping at the hem where it had begun to fray. He carried coffee in one hand and a wrapped bundle of oats in the other. Virginia met him by the barn, one hand resting on the stall door, the other shielding her eyes from the light. They worked without much talking, which was how they both seemed to prefer it. The horse's wound was healing well, scabbing beneath the linen and salve. Flint stood steadier now, favoring his leg, but no longer trembling. You hammer like a man, trying not to think she had told him, and the word stuck. Maybe it was true. Cade didn't mind the work, it gave shape to his days. He'd mended the north fence that morning, checked the water troughs. Now he leaned his weight against the barn rail while Virginia layered new dressing with hands steady and capable. You sure you're not looking to leave come fall? She asked quietly, her focus still on the horse. No, Cade replied without pause. She looked up, then catching the certainty in his voice. You're not restless, not in ways that matter. She studied him for a moment like she was trying to read a language she'd forgotten how to speak. Then she passed him the last strip of linen and nodded toward the grain bin. Go on. He's earned his breakfast. Cade moved to fetch the oats, and as he did, Virginia watched the way he moved through her space, not as a stranger anymore, but not quite a part of it yet either. There was a rhythm forming between them, she could feel it. Unnamed, perhaps, but real. A new gate, a shared silence. That evening, Cade returned with more than oats or bandages. He brought lumber, fresh-cut cedar slats, smooth and straight. He didn't say what it was for, but Virginia knew the moment she saw him measuring the posts, the old south gate. She didn't offer to help. Instead, she let him work, standing quietly on the porch as the sound of his hammer echoed off the hills. She wore her apron, still flour on her wrists from kneading bread, and when the last nail was driven and the gate swung on its new hinge with a soft creak, she carried out a plate handed it to him without ceremony, and walked to the bench beneath the cottonwood. They sat in the cool hush of dusk, the creek murmuring in the distance, a dragonfly passing between them. Virginia ate slow, then spoke without turning. "You hammer like a man trying not to think," she said again. Cade smiled into his plate. "My father used to say that too. When I was young, I'd fix everything. Broken chairs, cracked door frames, wagon wheels I had no business touching. Anything to keep my hands busy. Was he a carpenter, a blacksmith? Big hands, quiet mouth. Drank too much after my mother passed. He died when I was 15. I left the same week." Virginia set her plate down beside her. "I planted lilacs behind the smokehouse the spring after my brother died." Cade turned toward her. "Did they bloom?" She nodded once. "Not that year, but the one after. They were quiet after that. The kind of quiet that didn't ache. It felt full, like something living had been placed gently between them and left to grow in its own time. Ghosts that stay quiet." The wind picked up, rustling the cottonwood leaves overhead. Virginia leaned back against the bench, arms crossed over her chest, eyes fixed on the first stars beginning to blink into view. Cade sat beside her, elbows on his knees, gaze low. "You miss him," he said, almost more statement than question. "I miss being known," she replied. "I miss someone remembering me from before." Cade didn't speak, but she could feel the weight of his listening. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked, not looking at him. Cade was quiet for a long breath. "Then softly I think about building something. Not with blueprints or bricks. Just something lasting." Virginia turned her head, eyes meeting his in the half-light. "I don't need another roof," she said, voice low. "Not if you're already under mine." His mouth twitched almost a smile. "Then I'll build a porch off this one. For sitting. After long days. We'll need a bench. I'll make one." They didn't touch then. They didn't have to. But something between them clicked into place, not sudden, not loud. Just solid. Like a beam settling into a frame that had waited too long to be finished. That night she left the door unlatched. That night the silence no longer felt empty. Building toward belonging. By mid-June, the days had grown long and thick with heat. Wild sage released its scent in the breeze, and Virginia's skirts brushed against it as she stepped out of the barn, wiping her hands on her apron. Cade was already crouched near the hen-house, sleeves rolled high, hammer tapping at a stubborn latch. The chickens squawked indignantly behind him, feathers flaring like gossiping old women. "You always this handy with things that don't talk back?" Virginia asked, leaning against the doorway. He glanced over his shoulder, sweat glinting at his temple. "Only when they're less likely to kick." She laughed softly, crossing the yard to stand beside him. "You were meant to help me dig the irrigation trench today." "I know," Cade said, tightening the last nail, "but your hens were one raccoon away from declaring independence." She crouched and tested the latch. Solid. She gave him a nod. "I'll allow the delay." He straightened and dusted off his hands. "You got that ditch map in the shed?" "My brother drew the original. I've changed some routes, ground shifted after last year's thaw." "I'll walk it with you," he offered. "Easier to market fresh." They headed up past the garden where tobacco plants were just starting to sprout and climbed the rise behind the barn. Below the creek coiled through the cottonwood grove like a silver ribbon, its murmuring steady and low. Virginia pointed with her shovel toward a bend in the stream. If we cut in from there, we can drop a line straight toward the corn rows. It'll hold slope better than the old cut." Cade studied the angle and nodded. "We'll need to stake it. Dig shallow at first to keep the water from running too fast." She moved ahead, testing the soil with her blade. "It's softer than I expected. Might go quicker than planned." He didn't answer right away. His eyes were on two mule deer grazing near the tree line, their bodies still as breath. When they flicked their ears but didn't run, he spoke. "You ever think about selling this place?" Virginia paused. "Why would I? You once said you didn't plan to stay." "I wondered if part of you still wanted to go." She leaned on the handle of her shovel, considering. "I don't wonder anymore." And neither, it seemed, did he. A life that could stay. They marked the trench line with stones and twine, working through the heat until shadows began to lengthen. As they packed up the tools, Cade looked over the land with a quieter gaze than usual. "You ever think about what kind of life you want here?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Virginia didn't answer right away. A hawk circled above, casting a fleeting shadow over the earth. "I think about a home that doesn't feel borrowed," she said at last. "A place where the silence doesn't ache." Cade nodded slowly, the way someone does when they feel a thing in their bones. "I want that too." They returned to the house as the sun painted everything gold. Flint grazed near the barn, his coat catching the light like a burnished coin. Inside, Virginia pulled 2 tin plates from the shelf and didn't ask if Cade was staying. He didn't ask if he was wanted. She ladled stew into the bowls while he drifted toward the hearth, picking up a wooden carving from the mantel. "This yours?" he asked. "My father's." He carved it. Said it was a bear, but I always thought it looked more like a dog. He turned it over in his hands. "You keep a lot of things that don't quite fit." "I keep what's real," she replied. He stepped closer, still holding the carving. "You ever think about what comes next?" "I think about weeding the garden," she said, eyes on the stove. "Splitting wood before the rains. Fixing the roof for another winter. And if someone wanted to help with all that, I'd wonder how long they'd stay." "I'd stay," Cade said softly. She turned, then fully, her eyes steady. "Then start with the garden. No need for declarations." They sat side by side on the bench beneath the cottonwood, its leaves whispering above them. Virginia pointed toward a patch where the lilacs had just begun to bloom again, pale violet and fragrant. She leaned forward, pinching a dead blossom from the stalk, and then looked up at Cade. "I've got an extra cot in the loft," she said. "I've got a bedroll in my saddlebag," he replied. They didn't speak of love. They didn't name it. But in that pause, something ancient passed between them, something more rooted than vows or rings. As twilight softened the edges of the world, they walked back toward the cabin together. The door shut behind them just as the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky. The next morning came warm and humming. Virginia stepped into the barn, late apron tied at her waist arms smudged with dirt. Cade was already there, sleeves rolled high as he worked on a new latch for the hen house. She paused in the doorway and smiled, then crossed to him with a quiet confidence that no longer needed permission. They didn't talk much that day. But they didn't need to. What had started with bandages and borrowed trust had grown into something steady, something that didn't rattle when the wind blew, something worth keeping. Digging roots, By late July, the sun scorched high and relentless over the Montana plains, baking the soil to a hard rust red. Cade stood knee-deep in the irrigation trench he and Virginia had dug weeks before, sweat darkening his shirt shovel clinking against stone. The line they'd marked now ran clean and purposeful, carrying just enough water from the swollen creek to reach the squash patch sprawling along the lower field. Virginia approached from the tree line, a coil of twine around one wrist and a sickle in her other hand. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows, and a streak of dirt crossed her cheekbone, probably from wiping away sweat. She looked more like she belonged to the land than anyone Cade had ever known. And when she reached him, she dropped a bundle of fresh-cut sage across the porch rail without a word before stepping down toward the trench. "Stream's slowing," she said, squinting toward the bend. "We'll need to dam it come September if we want to hold enough for winter. I can ride north," Cade offered. "Find where it's thinning. Might be a blockage near the ridge." "You do that." She nodded, resting her sickle on her shoulder. "You've got 2 legs and a horse. I've got root cellars to prep." He smiled faintly, leaning on his shovel. "You talk like you've always belonged here." "I haven't," she replied, "but I do now." Her gaze dropped to the ground between them, then rose again. "You're not looking to leave, no. You're not restless." He shook his head. "Not in ways that matter." She passed him the sickle. "Go cut the thistle back before it seeds. If I see one more patch in the squash, I'm throwing rocks." He grinned, took the blade, and headed off. That night, they shelled beans by lantern light, sitting by the window while the frogs began their chorus outside and the barn glowed with the warmth of an oil lamp. Cade had repaired the loft ladder hinge that afternoon, and Virginia had noticed the way he'd spoken to the chickens, soft, amused like someone talking to old friends. "You ever think about having children?" she asked, suddenly not looking up from the bowl. Cade's hands stilled. "I have. I'd like to, with the right woman." Virginia nodded slowly. "I've thought about it too. Never said it out loud before." He looked over at her. "I'd want them to know work," she said. "Know how to fix things, read the land, but I'd want them to laugh too. To feel safe." Cade nodded. "I'd want them to know what it means to stay." They finished in silence, but the air between them had shifted again, warmer, more certain. Virginia covered the bowl with a cloth and rose to check the stove. Cade followed her with his eyes, the way she moved like she had lived 1,000 lives in quiet, more than shelter. "I've been thinking," Cade said, stepping up behind her, voice low and steady, "about building something." She turned slowly, cautious, but not cold. "What kind of something?" "A second cabin," he said. "Small room. Porch. Space for what might come next." Virginia was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled behind her. She could smell pine on his clothes, fresh cut. "I don't need another roof," she said finally, "if you're already under mine." He stepped closer, not touching her, but not far either. "Then I'll build a porch off this one. For sitting. End of long days." She smiled, soft, genuine. "We'll need a bench. I'll make one." They stood there in the glow of the hearth, 2 people who hadn't expected anything to last, suddenly building a life out of Nail's silence and unspoken promises. Virginia reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, as if they had always belonged there. By August, the grasses turned gold. The wheat bowed with weight, and Cade, shirt off in the heat, laid the first row of cedar boards for the porch with slow precision. Virginia brought him water in a chipped enamel mug, sometimes resting her hand against his back without needing to speak. They had begun sleeping beside one another, not from loneliness, but ease. She stitched new pillow covers from a flour sack. He carved a frame to hang her mother's old knife above the hearth. One morning, he found her out by the lilacs. Her hands were in the soil dirt smeared across her forearms. She looked up when he approached. "You're planting again." She nodded. "I want them blooming come spring." Cade crouched beside her, touching the edge of a root. "We'll be here to see it." "I know." She leaned over and kissed his cheek soft sure and turned back to the earth like it was a promise. What stays? They married at the edge of the cottonwood grove. No preacher, no papers, just her hand in his and Flint standing quietly behind them. Virginia wore her hair loose for the first time. Cade wore the same coat he'd arrived in, now patched at the elbow from mending the barn roof. There were no witnesses, but there was truth. That night they sat on the new porch. The bench Cade had built was just wide enough for two. They watched the last of the sun catch the tops of the hills, warm and orange, fading slow. "You happy?" Cade asked, voice low. Virginia tilted her head, eyes steady. "I am." He kissed her, slow, unhurried, the kind of kiss that didn't need explanation, the kind that had waited its time. Winter came. They weathered it together. Cade chopped ice for the troughs. Virginia dried apples in the stove's heat. They read by lantern light, played cards on the floor, and when the wind howled, she rested her head on his chest and listened to his heartbeat like it was the only steady thing left in the world. Come spring, the lilacs bloomed again, thicker, fuller. Their scent drifted through the open windows like forgiveness. Virginia stood in the doorway, hand resting on the curve of her belly. Cade beside her, the earth beneath them quiet and sure. They had not escaped the world, but they had built something that stayed. A map in the dirt. The river had thinned by mid-August, no longer swollen from meltwater, but a steady ribbon of glass that shimmered under the Montana sun. Cade stood in the trench boots, sunk ankle-deep in the cool, damp soil, watching the irrigation line do its job. Water trickled slow but steady toward the lower squash field where green vines sprawled across the ground like open arms. The work he and Virginia had started months ago was holding. Not perfect, but enough. Virginia approached from the edge of the tree line, a sickle in one hand and a coil of twine wrapped around the other. Her sleeves were rolled and her cheeks were flushed, streaked with dirt. She moved with a quiet certainty that never failed to catch Cade off guard, like the earth had memorized her and she in turn had memorized every rhythm of its seasons. "Stream's losing speed," she said, glancing toward the distant bend. "Come September, we'll need to dam the corner if we want to hold enough for winter." "I can ride north," Cade offered, setting his shovel against the trench wall. "Check where the runoff's slowing. Could be a blockage up near the ridge." Virginia nodded. "You do that. I've got root cellars to prep." He smirked, brushing sweat from his brow. "You talk like this land was always yours." She tilted her head. "You talk like you've always belonged to it." He shrugged. "I haven't." She looked at him carefully. "But do you now?" Cade didn't answer with words. He just nodded once, firm, unshaken. Virginia passed him the sickle. "Go cut the thistle back before it seeds. If I find more in the squash, I'll start throwing rocks." Cade chuckled, took the sickle, and walked toward the weedy edge of the field, shaking his head. Behind him, Virginia watched his silhouette disappear into the tall green and ordinary man in a quiet place, but no longer a stranger to any of it. The sound of something real. That night, the sun dropped behind the hills like a curtain falling on a long day. Inside the cabin, a single lantern flickered between them as they shelled beans into a wooden bowl, the rhythm of work broken only by the distant hum of frogs and the creak of the barn's hanging lamb. Cade had fixed the loft ladder earlier that week. Virginia had noticed the way he spoke softly to the chickens, like they understood him, or he hoped they did. "You ever think about having children?" she asked, eyes still on the beans, her voice casual but low. Cade looked up, surprised but not unsettled. "I have," he said slowly. "I'd like to, with the right woman." Virginia nodded, setting an empty pot aside. "I've thought about it too. Never said it out loud before. No one to say it to." His hand paused over the bowl. "I'd want them to grow up knowing how to work," she said. "How to read the land, how to mend what breaks. But I'd want them to laugh too, to feel safe, to know what it means to stay," Cade said, finishing the thought for her. She looked at him, then really looked, and the weight of their silence wrapped around them like the warmth of the stove behind her. They didn't speak again until the bowl was full. Virginia rose to check the heat, and Cade watched the way she moved sure-footed, like someone who had already built a life long before he'd come into it. He stood and stepped close, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. "I've been thinking," he said, "about building on the south side, a second cabin, small room, a porch." She turned to him, eyes unreadable. "Separate," he shook his head. "Not separate, just more space for what comes next." Virginia studied his face, quiet. "I don't need another roof if you're under mine." Cade's hand dropped to a wrist thumb, brushing along the inside gently. "Then I'll build a porch off this one, for sitting after long days." She smiled, a real one, slow and soft. "We'll need a bench. I'll make one." Planting what matters. By the third week of August, the first row of lumber had been laid. Cade worked shirtless in the heat sun, browning his skin as he measured each board with slow precision. The sound of hammering drifted across the yard, where Virginia carried buckets of laundry to the line. She paused now and then to bring him water, sometimes resting a hand against his back, just to feel the solidness of his presence. They had begun sleeping beside one another, not from need, but because it felt like the natural thing to do. She had stitched new pillowcases from an old flour sack. He had carved a frame for her mother's knife and hung it above the hearth like it belonged there. One morning, Cade found her kneeling in the lilac bed, sleeves pushed, high hands deep in the earth. "You're planting again?" he asked. Virginia looked up, hair clinging to her forehead, arms streaked with dirt. "I want them blooming come spring." He crouched beside her, resting on his heels. "We'll be here to see it." "I know," she said, and leaned in to kiss his cheek soft, certain not needing to mean anything more than what it already was. They married quietly at the edge of the cottonwood grove. No preacher, no witnesses. Just her hand in his, and Flint standing nearby like a quiet blessing. She wore her hair loose. He wore his patched coat. They said no vows. They didn't need to. That night they sat on the bench Cade had built, watching the stars climb over the ridge. His arms circled her shoulders, her head tilted toward his. "You happy?" he asked. "I am." He kissed her, slow, sure, no rush in it. A kiss with nothing to prove, only something to stay. Through the storm winter came, as it always did, hard and sharp, with winds that rattled window panes and snow that buried the fences in silence. But this time, Virginia didn't face it alone. Cade chopped wood while snowflakes clung to his beard and lashes, his breath fogging the air as he split logs with steady swings. He cleared paths between the barn and cabin, broke the ice on the water troughs, and made sure the chickens had enough warmth to last the long nights. Inside, Virginia dried apples in the stove's slow heat, strung herbs above the hearth, and lined jars along the cellar shelves with care and memory stitched into each lid. They read aloud on the rug beside the fire books Cade had found in a trade outpost months earlier, their pages soft with wear. He had a way of reading slowly, like the words mattered more than just story. Sometimes they played cards, her laughter returning, like something shy learning to walk again. When the wind howled outside, Virginia didn't flinch the way she used to. Instead, she rested her head against Cade's chest and let his heartbeat ground her. He never spoke during those moments. He just held her quiet and strong until the night softened. There were mornings when the windows frosted thick and the barn door had to be shoved open with a shoulder. Cade always rose first, made coffee, lit the fire. And when she came down the ladder with sleep still heavy in her eyes, he'd be waiting with a tin mug and a kiss pressed to her temple. He never asked for thanks. She never offered it with words. But the gratitude was in the way she folded his shirts from the line, in the way she baked cornbread just the way he liked it, golden and crisp along the edges. It was in the way they moved around one another without needing to speak, as if their days had begun to take shape like clay molded by steady hands. When spring came, it wasn't sudden. It came like a sigh, a soft cracking in the earth. The lilacs bloomed again, this time thicker than the years before, their scent curling through the cabin's open windows like a whispered promise. The weight of blooming one morning. Virginia stood in the doorway with the sun slanting across the porch, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. Cade stood beside her, stilling mid-step when he noticed. She hadn't said anything, not yet, but she didn't need to. He looked at her, then at her hand, then back at her eyes. "You sure?" he asked softly. She nodded. "As sure as I've ever been." Cade stepped close, pressing his hand gently over hers, the warmth of her body radiating through wool and cotton and something deeper. "I didn't think I'd have this again," he said, voice low. "Me either." The earth beneath them felt steady, like it was holding its breath in reverence. Later that afternoon, Cade built a cradle. It wasn't polished or fancy, just cedar wood and calloused hands and quiet hope. Virginia sat on the porch steps mending socks and watching him work. She didn't say anything until he wiped his brow and stood back. "It's not finished," he said. "It's perfect," she replied. And she meant it. The things that stay. The cabin smelled of bread and wood smoke. The windows were open to let in the lilac breeze. Inside, above the hearth, Cade's carved frame held her mother's knife like a sacred relic, the blade catching flickers of firelight. The bench outside had begun to smooth with use, the grain worn down by evening spent watching the sky. In the barn, Flint stood older but solid. Cade brushed him down in the late light, the sound of the brush rhythmic grounding. Nearby, Virginia fed the hens, one hand resting on his back. Now her steps slower, more deliberate. At supper, they didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The days had shaped themselves around each other, language tucked into glances, gestures half smiles. After they cleared the dishes, Cade reached for her hand and led her to the porch. They sat beneath the stars, her head against his shoulder, her fingers curled around his. "I still think about all the places I've been," Cade murmured. Virginia turned her face toward him. "And I don't miss a single one of them." She smiled faintly, her eyes closing as the wind stirred her hair. They didn't make plans. They didn't speak of forever, but in the hush between stars, in the creak of the bench, in the life-taking root beneath Virginia's ribs, they had already built something that would last. Epilogue. What grows from staying? By the time the harvest moon rose in September, the wheat stood tall and gold bowing in the wind, like it knew how much had been carried to reach this season. The porch was finished wide and sturdy, with Cade's bench settled beneath the window. It had become a kind of sacred place, not for prayer, not for memory, but for being, for watching, for feeling the rhythm of the land hum beneath their boots. Cade had started carving again, small things mostly, handles, bowls, spoons with smooth curves. He did it in the evenings while Virginia folded clothes or stirred broth. She liked the sound of the knife on wood. It reminded her of trust, of repetition, of things that could be shaped over time. He found her out by the lilacs one morning, knees in the dirt, hands gently cupping the base of a stalk. She didn't speak until he crouched beside her. "You're planting again?" he asked. She nodded. "I want them bloomin' come spring." He smiled, brushing his fingers over a nearby bud. "We'll be here to see it." "I know," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice anymore. They married weeks before, simple as rain. At the edge of the cottonwood grove, with Flint grazing quietly in the background. No vows, just her hand in his, and the understanding that everything worth keeping had already been said in silence. She wore her hair loose. He wore the same coat he rode in, with elbow patched from fixing fence posts. The ceremony wasn't witnessed by anyone else, but they never felt alone. That night, they sat on the new bench Cade had built, arms, brushing legs pressed together. The stars were high and sharp, scattered like nails across a velvet board. The wind carried the scent of pine and freshly turned soil. "You happy?" he asked, her voice low, like he didn't need the answer, only the comfort of asking. She looked up at him steady. "I am." He kissed her, slow, unhurried. The kind of kiss you give someone when there's nowhere else to be. When winter returned, it came like it always had, cold and unrelenting, but this time it didn't steal anything. Cade chopped ice for the troughs. Virginia dried fruit by the stove and stitched tiny clothes with fingers that paused sometimes, then resumed. They read by the fire, played cards, laughed at nothing. When the wind screamed, she would rest her cheek against his chest and listen for the heartbeat that had anchored her through every season since. And in the spring, yes, the lilacs bloomed again. Stronger than before, thicker. Their scent curled through the cabin windows like a breath held all winter finally exhaled. Virginia stood barefoot at the doorway, Cade behind her, one hand resting gently on the small curve of her belly. The earth beneath them wasn't loud. It didn't celebrate, but it held them, quiet and sure. They had not run. They had not escaped. They had stayed. And what they built, board by board, seed by seed, moment by moment, was not perfect, not grand, not the kind of love that burned wild. But it was the kind that rooted deep and stayed.